Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to talk about man's methods of thinking and coming to true knowledge. How do we know certain things? How do we come to conclusions after perceiving reality and gain valid knowledge about the world? Um, and this is extremely important. Learning how we know, learning how we sort of look at reality, come to conclusions, and make generalizations about reality is extremely important because we need to do this to understand reality and to live ultimately. So primarily, this is ultimately the reason to understand how you know things is so that you can go out and live. You want to be able to live a good life. You want to be able to induce principles. You want to be able to discover true knowledge about reality so that it can guide your actions. Reason is man's means of survival. This is how we survive. Our primary means to continue living, to obtain food, for example, obtain shelter, obtain clothing, just these very fundamental things. We need to be able to know how to figure things out about reality. This is what is unique to humans. Animals, they just let whatever sensory data comes in hit them, and they basically rely off of reflexes to go out and do whatever certain things are implied by their instincts, or not instincts necessarily, that might not be a precise word, but whatever their reflexes decide based off the perceptual concretes that hit them. And humans are different though. Humans form concepts. Humans think and act long range. We need to go out and think, okay, how am I going to obtain these certain things? How am I going to obtain food? How am I going to obtain clothing? How am I going to find shelter? How am I going to make this shelter? We don't have anything pre-built into us like these animals do with these reflexes. There's no user's manual to man's survival. We have to go out and discover these things on our own. We have to go out and discover different aspects of reality on our own and form our concepts on our own. We have to do all of this essentially on our own. Obviously, we do have some help from other people who have already done stuff in the past, but to actually understand these things, we have to discover them for ourselves in a sense. You can get pointed to certain things by other people, but you have to go look at them to actually understand them. You can't accept things on faith. You need to understand things by reason so that you can properly apply them to your life and so that you can properly live, so that you can understand reality. So we need to know certain things about reality. We need to come to understand reality. But how do we do this? What are our methods by which we come to understand reality? Primarily, our whole method integrated together would just be called reason. It's our reasoning mind, our ability to form judgments, our ability to form principles, our ability to do all these sort of things that our mind does. And we have to be very scrupulously consistent with reality. We need to non-contradictory. We have to identify things in reality, and they can't contradict each other because A is A. We discover this very quickly in life, at least implicitly, even before we can name that we understand identity. So we have to discover certain things about reality. We need to use non-contradictory identification, which is logic, basically. We need to be able to identify aspects of reality and make sure that they don't contradict. We need to make this sort of integrated whole of our knowledge, so that because everything in reality is integrated together. Everything is connected. And once we can do this, once we can use our reason to form these integrations in our mind, these concepts in our mind, we can act long range. And we can act in reality and be confident in our assertions, in our beliefs, in our actions, in everything that we do. And we can understand how to live. We can understand how to achieve happiness as well, and how to know things. And primarily, that's for selfish reasons, because we want to live. We have to know things to live. Reason is man's means of survival. So, how do we do this? What are our methods of knowing? Well, there are three primary methods that I generally think of when I think about this. We have to first perceive reality. Then we need to induce. We need to form certain concepts, form certain generalizations, and then we can deduce to see the implications of our principles that we've induced. So how do each of these processes work, and how do we know that they're valid primarily? How do we know that how do we use these processes? What are they? How do we know that they're valid? And that's kind of what I'm going to talk about in this video. So let's begin where everything begins when it comes to obtaining knowledge, with perception. How do we know that our senses are valid primarily? How do we know that? Well, first of all, that is an invalid question. It is our senses they give us real knowledge of reality. They give us the interaction between our sense organs and reality, and any sort of questioning of that is completely arbitrary. How would you disprove that? You would have to use other evidence, but the only evidence we get from anything is our sensory data. Our sensory data is our only connection with reality. Our sensory data gives us real interactions between our sense organs and reality. It is possible for our mind to interpret them incorrectly. This is what we call illusions. And there's certain subconscious things that we can do where our mind kind of takes a shortcut, where it takes a shortcut from this sensory data that is infallible, basically, and it jumps to a false conclusion. And so we can be wrong about what we perceive, but these are illusions. But we can look underneath them and see, oh no, this is why this thing comes up. This is why this thing interacts with our sense organs this way, and this is why our mind interprets it in that way. Your sense organs are not wrong in this sense. It is a misinterpretation based on your volitional consciousness, because your consciousness, your mind, it can come to false conclusions. That's something possible. That is something possible because of the fact that we are volitional beings, because we have free will. So we can come to false conclusions, but that does not mean that our sense organs are wrong. Our sense organs cannot be wrong. They are simply an interaction in reality. And the job of our mind is to understand what this interaction means, and we can discover true things about reality by these means. And this is sort of the basis of all our knowledge. We just look out at reality and we see that there's this existent has these certain features, and this is its identity. And we can see that about all these different existents when we focus on them and decide to think about them and try to understand what they are. We can also see different connections between things. We can see that things behave causally in certain ways. Like, you can drop certain things and they'll fall, or you can drop other things like a balloon and it'll rise up. You can discover certain causal interactions between things through your perception as well. And these things are necessarily valid because they're simply the interaction between your sense organs and reality. There's also another sort of means of perception, which is introspection, which I'm not going to get super deep into right now because that's not the essential of what this video is about, but we can look, I guess there's a sense in which that's important as well. But we can sort of look inward. We can look inward at our mind and come to certain conclusions about our emotional state, about our conscious states. So we can discover emotions, we can discover free will, we can discover all these sort of things through introspection, because those things don't exist out in reality. They're simply aspects of our consciousness that we can look inward and perceive. So that's well, I guess they do exist in reality because consciousness is part of reality, but it's not part of this like external world that we see. So we can use both introspection and extrospection to come to knowledge. These are things that we perceive. We perceive these directly, and there's no question of, oh, is this valid or not? The entire basis for judging validity of things is based on your sense organs. It's based on your sensory data. So you can't question that. It's an absurd question, and it's completely arbitrary, and it will necessarily lead you into pure skepticism and this idea that we can't really know anything, and you can never act based on that. If you are consistent in your skepticism, you can never discover anything in reality, and you should just basically sit in your room, close your eyes, and die away, because you can't know anything. You can't know that anything's true. But we do know things are true. We perceive it. That's the basis for everything. So once we perceive things, once we discover true things in our perception, we can begin to sort of form concepts based on them. We can omit measurements. We can generalize about certain things. We can group certain things together by their similarities, and based on the fact that there's differences between certain groups of things, we can group them together based on similarities, based on those differences. This is really complicated stuff, and I'm kind of glossing over the whole process of concept formation. If you really want to get deep into that, definitely read ITOE, and you'll understand it a lot better. This video is not necessarily the goal of this video is not to talk about concept formation. It's more to talk about our methods of discovering things in reality, which I guess concept formation is a part of, but I'm more looking to talk about perception, induction, and deduction in this video specifically. So basically, yeah, from perception we can form concepts, and we can form generalizations about these concepts through a process called induction. It's this process of going from perceiving certain things about certain concepts, going from some to all, basically. That's the primary here. We look at certain some interactions or some entities or existence. Some existence. We can look at some reactions or interactions between them, and we can see that we can discover certain causal interactions between these concepts that we formed, and we can come to generalizations about them by looking at how these causal interactions work between certain existence, between certain concepts. We basically see certain interactions between existence, and then we can generalize them about the concepts that underlie them. Once we understand that this is a causal process, that this is something that happens based on the fact that this is in the nature of these entities or existence, rather than it's just some sort of correlation that's due to some other underlying cause or some other underlying lurking variable. So it's basically this process of forming principles, of forming generalizations from perception, from things that we perceive. And to do this, it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of seeing different interactions occur, because we can't, just because we see that something, that one entity falls or one existent falls based off of, we see one falls, it falls toward the earth. Well, then we don't necessarily know what that means. We don't know that everything's going to fall. We just know that this one thing falls. So then we see more things fall, and over again, we see more and more things fall, and we can generalize that, oh, there's this principle that things go towards the ground, and that would be gravity. But also then later we discover certain things like balloons floating upwards. So we have to sort of modify our knowledge here. This is sort of the principle that knowledge is contextual. When certain facts hold, when certain variables hold to be true, we can come to general knowledge about these certain things. We can come to the knowledge that things that are with a density less than the air, they're going to fall towards the earth, or things that are not going to. Yeah, I don't know necessarily why balloons rise. I think that's the general reason why. Although I am not by any means a physicist. I did take physics classes in high school, but I did do well in them, but that's not something that I want to get too deep into right now. But so we can come to these general conclusions. We can use induction to form general conclusions about things, to form general principles about how things work, how things interact. And this is a complicated process, and a lot of people are like, we cannot be certain about induction because it's just based off of going from some to all. How can we generalize if we don't see every single possible interaction between these things? Like, what if on the other side of the universe there's a thing where A does not equal A? Now, this is absurd. There's no reason to think that on the other side of the universe this would be true. It's a completely arbitrary assertion that is used basically to discredit inductive knowledge. And we know inductive knowledge is true. We act based on it constantly. This is what we use to survive. This is sort of the basis of our knowledge. So we know these things are true. But the actual process of how we know that they're true is very complicated, and Ayn Rand did not work that out during her lifetime. There's David Harriman's book, The Logical Leap, which he wrote, and he gave sort of a theory of induction in that. I have not read that book yet. I've skimmed through some of the chapters, and I've read the chapter, one of the chapters on induction, and his theory largely makes sense, although I don't know if I could explain it perfectly here. Basically, the gist of what I got out of that is that, when we abduce, we make these sort of observations of these causal interactions between things, and seeing these causal interactions between certain concepts necessitates that if we form these concepts right, that this causal interaction is going to hold true. It's going to be a general fact about these causal interactions. So that was my basic understanding. That's a broad summary of this thing, but it's a lot more complicated than deduction. Deduction is a lot simpler than an induction, because when we do induction, we need to we have all these concepts already formed. Your induction has to integrate with everything. Your induction is related to basically every single other thing. It's a relation to every other thing in existence, and we're not necessarily sure that we can pin down a certain causal interaction between certain things. But we know that we can, because we can basically isolate certain variables. We can isolate these certain interactions, and we can discover truth based on that. We can discover true principles based on that. So after we do that, essentially we can form these broader principles. So this is what we do in induction. Induction is going from some to all. And yeah, there's people who say we can't do that with absolute certainty. I would disagree with them. I think we can do that with certainty, based on the fact also that, and an important thing to keep in mind here, I guess, would be that knowledge is contextual. So we can form inductions in certain contexts. We can say that at this certain elevation on the Earth, water will freeze at 32 degrees Fahrenheit or 0 degrees Celsius. So we can form that generalization, but we can go somewhere else and we'll see that, water boils or freezes at a different temperature. And then we can try to understand the reason why for that, and that's a different sort of induction. And so then we generally see this reason why water freezes, but we also know that in this certain context, the water will freeze at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. So then we can form that general knowledge. We can form that principle, and then we can apply that in that context. Now it takes more work to understand why these certain differences occur based on these different variables, but in general we can come to these conclusions after doing more observation, after doing more integration of these things. Induction is a lot harder because you have to integrate everything. You have to integrate it with everything, and you can see something's true in a certain context, but if you change the context, it might not necessarily hold true, and you have to understand why in this context it does it and not in this context. But you still have this induction that this thing is true in this certain context, but when you move to a different context, you have to try to sort of induce why this changing of these certain variables in this context changes your result in this context, and then you can come to more inductions, more principles that you can discover about these things. So this might not be the most clear explanation of induction, but induction is not necessarily something that is the most clear in my mind either, but it's a very complicated process. It's a very complicated process. If I got anything wrong, please comment below, but I think I did a decent job of explaining why we can sort of come to knowledge of all things due to knowledge of some things. And this is the basis by which we can form any principle. This is the basis by which we can come to knowledge, because it's going from perception, observing all these perceptual concretes, to a truth, to knowledge, to a concept, to a principle about the concept, to a judgment about a certain thing. So then this is how we come to knowledge. This is the primary means by which we gain new knowledge. So after we have induction, after we've induced certain principles, then we can use deduction to see the implications of these principles and to understand more about these principles and more about how they integrate with other principles that we've already discovered. So one common example, or I guess I should define deduction first. Deduction, instead of going from sum to all, like induction does, deduction goes from all to some. So you take a general principle and then you apply it to certain things. Deduction is sort of this process of application, seeing the implications of your principles, seeing okay, now that we know these principles are true, what does this actually mean? What does this mean for us? So that's what deduction sort of does. And to do deduction, you need to have induced principles already. You cannot deduce based off of no induced truth. You have to have some sort of induction before you can do deduction. So induction is primary. I wouldn't necessarily say it's like a superior method, but induction is primary. You can come to truths based on both induction and deduction, but you need to do induction before you can do any sort of deduction. So the process of deduction is you go from these certain premises, you know that these certain things are true, and then you come to a sort of conclusion. And this conclusion is necessarily true based on if your premises are true. A deduction is necessarily true based on your premises. This is an important principle to keep in mind as well. However, if one of your premises is wrong, then your deduction is not true. It does not apply to reality. Now, there's certain deductions that are valid, but they're based on incorrect premises. Like, let's say, for example, I said that all shirts are green, and then this shirt that I'm wearing is a shirt, therefore the shirt is green. that would be that would be, I think the term would be, it would be valid, but it wouldn't be true. I don't know the exact terminology, but there's I think, so that would be a valid induction, but it wouldn't actually be true to reality, because it's not true that all shirts are green. This shirt's black, for example, and we can induce that not all shirts are green by looking at different examples of shirts. But a example of a valid and true deduction would be like the whole Socrates is a man, and all men are mortal. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Since Socrates is a man, this is something that we can deduce or induce is true. We can look at all other men. We can discover that Socrates falls into that category. We know that that premise is true, and then we also know that all men are mortal by looking at individual men and seeing that all of them die eventually. We induce that truth, so then we can come to this conclusion that Socrates is mortal. Socrates will die someday, and as we know, he did die. So all men. So that is a necessarily true conclusion based on your premises. So your deduced truth is necessarily true, and deduction is a lot easier than induction because you don't need to integrate it with every other truth that you know. You don't need to sort of go through all these steps of inducing all these certain things, all these different observations. You can just take two principles, close your eyes, and come to a conclusion. You don't need to look at reality, although in a sense you do. You do need to look at reality to come to the induced principles that you're deducing from. But it's a lot more just mental effort. You're trying to deduce the implications of your induced principles and come to whatever conclusions may come based on these. Deduction is a valid form of knowledge. Deduction is a valid form of coming to truths. But it's important to be careful with it, because a lot of times when you're doing a deduction, you can start it based off of premises that you're not necessarily sure are true, but they feel true. They feel like they might be right. Like, for example, you have the whole Thomas Aquinas proof from causation. Like, everything is caused by something else, or the existence of everything is caused by, he sort of says that everything is caused by something else. And this feels true, but it's not necessarily true. You don't know this by induction. This is not necessarily a truth that he has made sure holds true to reality. You're not necessarily sure that everything is caused. Is the coming into existence of things caused? Well, this is what he sort of applies it to. This is what he applies the concept of everything being caused to. And this is pure rationalism. This is pure deduction. This is rationalism in a form of deduction based off of invalid premises, of premises that you sort of feel are true, but you didn't actually induce them from reality. So you need to be very careful with your principles here. And then there's another sense in which you can deduce things based off of premises that you don't necessarily explicitly state, and a lot of times these premises are completely false. These did not come from reality. With the whole argument for God's existence through motion, there's a sort of implicit premise that at the beginning of all things, all the things were not moving, which is sort of this implicit premise that is not necessarily true. The things could have started all in motion. You don't need everything to be set still in stone, and then all of a sudden to start, and that's how the universe begins. No, everything could have just been moving at the very beginning. That's another. I can go more in depth into these specific arguments for God's existence, because they are ultimately all rationalistic and they're all very faulty. But the primary fact here is that when you're doing deduction, it's very important to make sure that all of you explicitly state all of your premises, and that all of your premises are based on induced knowledge, on knowledge that you know is true. And if you don't do that, you're a rationalist. You're being rationalistic. This is what objectivists mean when we're talking about rationalism. If you simply just close your eyes and deduce certain principles based off of premises that you're a little shaky on. You feel might be true. You feel like they're probably true, but you didn't actually look at reality to induce them. You simply came to these conclusions on a whim, and you're essentially building these sort of castles in the sky, as I think it was Rand or Peikoff who described them like that. Yeah, you're building these castles in the sky based off of these premises that are disconnected from reality, and you're coming to these crazy conclusions that are super high level, super abstract, but they're not based on anything. They don't have any basis in reality, so they don't hold true to reality. You start with these arbitrary premises, and you just deduce away from there, and that is dangerous. You need to start with induction. You need to start with induced principles that you know are valid. And once you do that, once you have these principles, then you can deduce from them. Then you can validly induce and come to real truths based on these, based off of deduction, and these conclusions will be based off. And when you base them off of principles that are true in reality, these conclusions will be necessarily true, and you can act based off of them. And yeah, you can apply these very easily to your life. And deduction is very important because it's very, very much based off of like, what are the implications of my principles, and what should I do about these principles? And when you can deduce things, then you can act much more easily in reality, and you can integrate your knowledge a lot better too, because you can sort of deduce, or you can sort of use deduction to see how certain premises are related as well. You can sort of do that with the principle of identity and causality. Like, you can sort of try to deduce the principle of causality from identity, although that would be completely invalid. That's not actually how you prove any of these things. But when you try to do that, you see that, oh, these things are related in this way, and your knowledge sort of spirals. This is sort of what Peikoff talks about in Objectivism Through Induction in the first lecture. But yeah, deduction is important, and deduction is a very valid thing to do. But we need to constantly check our deductions against reality. We need to constantly make sure that we're applying these principles in the proper context, and that we're applying principles that are induced from reality as well. And when you can do that, you can form a real strong structure of knowledge where you are very certain that your principles are true, and you don't have this religious doubt about things constantly coming into your mind, and you can act in reality based on things that you know are true, and you know where they come from in reality. And when you think about this certain truth that you know, examples will just flood your mind, and you'll understand so much clearer how reality works and what you need to do in reality. So yeah, that was a longer video. Thank you all for watching. Feel free to correct anything that I said wrong in the comments, or ask questions if anything I said was unclear. This is a very complex topic that I still have a lot of learning to do on, and I'm sure everybody in the comment section does as well, because this is like the basis for knowledge, and these are the sort of things that it takes people years and years and years to fully understand. And I've been an objectivist for like 2 years now, and so yeah, I have a lot of work to do. So yeah, ask me questions in the comments, and I hope to clarify any questions you may have. But anyways, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next video. Peace.